Welcome to another Ontario 360 policy video from the Ontario 360 project housed at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Sean Spear. I'm a senior fellow at the Munk School and project co-director of Ontario 360. I'm joined as always by my project co-director, Drew Fagan, who's also a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And most importantly today, we're joined by a co-author of a recent policy brief we published at Ontario 360 entitled The Workforce Ontario Needs, How to Strengthen Skills Development. Kelly Pasolli is a senior advisor at Bllueprint and co-author of the policy brief along with her colleague, Karen Myers. Kelly, thank you so much for contributing to our pre-election series at Ontario 360 and taking the time to speak to us today about the policy brief's insights, analysis, and ultimately its policy recommendations.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get to your policy prescriptions and critique of the existing system, let's just, sketch out the challenge. A big mismatch between jobs and skills. Give us a sense, please, of how big it is, whether it continues to grow, what's causing it. Set the table for us, if you would.
Sure. So I think when we kind of think about the context that our skills development ecosystem is operating in, it's important to start with the impact, obviously, of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was obviously just a huge shock to Ontario's labor market. At the peak of the pandemic, our employment rate reached 13.6%, which means about 1 million people were out of work in May 2020. And many of the workers who were hardest hit were those who were already most vulnerable. So low-wage workers, newcomers, women with young children were those who were most impacted. But at the same time, the pandemic also surfaced and amplified a lot of trends that were already impacting the nature of work in Ontario. So things like job polarization and the kind of erosion of middle-skilled jobs, and of course, digital transitions and the impact of things like automation that are getting rid of some jobs and also changing other jobs permanently. And all of these changes are in turn creating a lot of pressure on Ontarians to build new skills that can help them succeed in this, quite turbulent labor market. And it's also putting pressure on employers who know that the skills of their workforce are going to need to evolve to confront changing business and economic realities. So what this has really resulted in is a case where employers are struggling to find the right talent. At the same time, many people are struggling to find the right career opportunities. And the skills mismatch can have an enormous impact. So the Conference Board of Canada recently released a report estimating that the unrealized value of skills vacancies in the Canadian economy hit $25 billion in 2020, which is over 1% of our GDP. And I don't think that this problem is going away. I think it's likely to get worse. There was also a recent survey suggesting that 43% of Canadian workers are looking at changing jobs in the next year. And, that's going to require new skills and supports for these people who are looking at career transitions. So there's a lot of untapped potential, I think, that we're leaving on the table right now by not doing more to help get the right people into the right jobs.
That's great. That sets the table, as I say, for the situation. Help us now with the supports. And one of the things I like about this paper is you set out the full range of sort of post-secondary educational supports, from traditional universities to apprenticeship programs to second career programs, as they're called, to something that's a little bit more trendy, micro-credentials. So help us with that a little bit, and where the bias lies, with regard to that before we look at, prescriptions for change.
Right. Yeah. So Ontario is investing a lot in skills development. But there's a real gap in where we invest as a province in terms of our sort of traditional education programs versus what we invest in skills training programs that target working age adults. So we spend much more on post-secondary education and apprenticeship programs than we spend on some of the key labor market programs that do exist for working adults, like Second Career, like Employment Ontario, Employment Services. And this approach made sense in a world in which career paths were more linear. So it used to be much more common for people to go to school, potentially then go on to obtain a post-secondary credential, and then go to work in one industry with sort of a clearly defined career path that would take them through most of their working lives. In a labor market like the one that we're living in now, that's just not feasible for a lot of people. People need opportunities to keep upskilling, to keep reskilling all throughout their working life so that they can be resilient to all the changes that are impacting the labor market. But we don't really, have the same policy and program infrastructure to enable that kind of lifelong learning in the way that we do for education for young people. So one way we've sort of thought about this, one metaphor that's helpful is to think of the skills development system like a three-legged table. So the first leg is for young people, which is our K-12 and post-secondary education systems. The second leg is for people who are unemployed. So this leg helps people who've lost their jobs find new work, like the services offered through Employment Ontario. And Ontario actually does pretty well in both of these areas. But the problem is that there's a whole third leg that's missing. And this third leg is support for working adults, right, many of whom are facing quite unprecedented challenges in navigating what's happening in the labor market. And I would also say that, so while post-secondary system is sort of where we invest the bulk of our skills development dollars, there's a lot of innovation happening in that post-secondary system that is looking at offering interventions that are more short-term, more flexible, and more geared towards lifelong learning. So a clear example of that is the almost $60 million that Ontario has invested in a micro-credential strategy. Right. So a quick definition of micro-credentials. In general, they're certification awarded for learning specific skills or competencies. So they differ from traditional post-secondary education offerings in that they're generally short, flexible, and they're more focused on job or industry-specific skills. So they're more accessible to people across their career journey. But like many things, the devil's really in the details when it comes to micro-credentials. So a little bit later when we move to recommendations, I can talk about what our recommendations are related to micro-credentials.
That's great.
Shelley, before we get to those specific recommendations, I think it's worth emphasizing the point you make about the three legs of the stool, so to speak. And I guess I have a two-part question. First, maybe just have you unpack a bit the tendency in Ontario employment and workforce development programming to sort of have something of a false binary. You're either employed or not employed, and the gap that exists for those who are represented in the third stool. And then secondly, this isn't the first paper that we've been proud to publish by Bllueprint over the past few years at Ontario 360. A previous paper sort of talked about the fact that we're still learning about the kind of characteristics and principles that seem to be associated with successful outcomes when it comes to lifelong learning and skills training programs. So as I say, a kind of two-part question. First, maybe just have you elaborate a bit on the need to break free from this false binary. And then second, any insights you have, as you say, the devil's in the details, but any insights you might have about what the literature tells us or experiential analysis tells us about characteristics or principles that tend to be associated with successful interventions for lifelong learning and skills training programs.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the first part of the question, I think what that really comes down to is like asking whether the programs and services that we currently have for working age adults are equipped to meet the challenges of the future of work. So the sort of bread and butter work of employment services in Ontario in particular is to help those who are in the here and now unemployed find work. And the employment services transformation that's currently underway is designed to do that work more effectively and more efficiently. But as we touched on, like these services are operating in a context of a labor market where people are at risk of losing their job in the future. We know that there's more people who are precariously employed or doing gig work. And so the sort of binary between you're employed and that means you're set and you don't need services, or you're unemployed and you need services just doesn't really hold a lot of water, I think, in the context that we're currently operating in. So I think it's time to ask whether the services that we do have are equipped with what they need to help guide people through this complex landscape. So like on the one hand, employment services are a huge asset, right? We have employment services centers all across Ontario that serve hundreds of thousands of Ontarians. But the question is, I think, how do we leverage that asset to start reaching individuals at all different stages of their career journey who are dealing with transitions, potential future disruptions, other challenges related to their career and employment? And how do we make sure they have a really sophisticated suite of services that reflects all the complexity of what's happening in the labor market? And so I think it's really important to start thinking about what strategies we could use to make sure that those employment services centers have the information, the expertise, the resources that they need to help individuals and businesses navigate what's going on.
That really takes us to the recommendations. In the wake of your description, Sean called a binary system and turning it into a continuum, if you like. You used the term fail first, which is to say you have to be out of work before you can take advantage of the majority of the programs, as opposed to planning for change in employment as if it's going to be a natural part of someone's career journey. So the recommendations and the shorter term recommendations, things that can be done relatively quickly that the next provincial government of whatever stripe might want to engage in, and longer term to grapple with those big mega changes that you were talking to off the top. Take us through those if you would.
Sure. So our short-term recommendations really focus in on how can we better reach to the two groups that, one of which we talked about already, but two groups that we feel like in the labor market are really at risk right now. So the first group I'll talk about is individuals with higher or more complex needs related to employability. So for this group, we recommend that the government invest in a program that will ensure that these high needs clients are effectively served under the employment services system. In Motion and Momentum is a program developed by the Canadian Career Development Foundation that helps individuals with pre-employability needs, and it's explicitly designed to help individuals address unresolved employment readiness challenges. And the evidence for the program so far to date is really promising. So we recommend that the incoming government invest in piloting this program in partnership with employment services providers and potentially use those learnings to inform a broader rollout across the province. Why this is really important is that if we don't ensure a meaningful service offering for these clients, there's a risk that we could keep seeing high levels of churn in the system. So In Motion and Momentum was actually designed to address specifically the problem where across Canada, we see a consistent cycle of individuals with more complex or multifaceted needs being referred inappropriately or too quickly into employment or to a training program, and where they don't often succeed because they have these unresolved challenges and they return to services, the cycle repeats. In Motion and Momentum tackles this challenge really head on by using a strengths-based approach that focuses on those cornerstone skills that individuals need to move forward. It helps them build confidence and motivation and really a sense that their contribution in the world matters. So it's a really important innovation that addresses an important gap in the typical suite of employment services offerings. And it's also, I think, a uniquely good fit for the transformed employment services system in Ontario, because the new system does offer higher levels of operational and performance-based funding for high needs clients, which is really important. This In Motion Momentum will really give these resources a place to go that's really likely to work for that group of higher needs clients. The second short-term recommendation touches on another group that we've talked about a little bit already, but it's workers at risk of disruption. So we know that there are a lot of workers in Ontario who are working now, but due to automation or climate transitions or a range of other factors, they're likely to be facing unemployment in the not so distant future. So what if we could find ways to reach these workers now and offer the supports and services that they need to prepare for that transition before they're stuck in the stress and the precarity that comes with unemployment. Because this is an area where we don't really see a lot of existing solutions, most of the, Sean, to your earlier point, most of the existing skills training programs that have been rigorously evaluated do focus on people who are unemployed already. We recommend that the government invest some targeted innovation funding to try to figure out new partnerships and new solutions that could help these workers. The existing Ontario Skills Development Fund provides a really good framework for this. And so our recommendation is really just to think about how to explicitly prioritize solutions for workers at risk of disruption in that fund that already exists to find new and innovative solutions to skills development challenges.
Kelly, so we've spoken a lot about government programming and the ways in which the government either directly or through service delivery partners can provide skills training and lifelong learning. One of the long-term recommendations thinks about the role for government policy to support individuals as consumers of different skills training programs and supports. Do you want to just talk about, maybe step back for a second? There's a lot of government support to individuals in order to defray the costs of post-secondary and so on, but there's not a lot of support for individuals to defray the costs of lifelong learning or micro-credentialing or whatever. Do you want to talk a bit about a potential intervention on the part of the provincial government to help individual workers obtain and pursue these different types of lifelong credentials?
Yeah, for sure. So there are forms of financial assistance for Ontarians to pursue skills development outside of post-secondary, but they're a bit piecemeal, they're a bit fragmented, they're a bit hard to make sense of, frankly. And often they come with sort of eligibility restrictions or financial caps that make it, I think, difficult for some workers to find what they need to pursue upskilling or reskilling opportunities that they might benefit from. And if we know that people are increasingly not kind of following those linear education and career paths, then I think we need to think about ways to enable people to pursue flexible upskilling and reskilling opportunities throughout their working lives. So one of our recommendations is that the government do some investigation and looking into testing new forms of financial assistance that can be more easily accessed by workers and job seekers to pursue different types of training. And one of the potential areas of exploration there is individual learning accounts. So there's a lot of different types of individual learning accounts that have been tested internationally in other jurisdictions, but essentially all individual learning accounts boil down to providing individuals with funds that they can then invest in training. So this means that the funds aren't tied to a particular job or to a particular employment status, and they give individuals a lot of choice and flexibility to pursue training that would help them advance in their career paths.
Well, that's great. And we've only just touched on, a portion of the analysis and recommendations it reflected in this policy brief by Kelly and her colleague, Karen Myers from Bllueprint. Maybe we'll just wrap up, Kelly. The incoming government will inherit, as you've referred to earlier, the employment systems transformation that's been going on for the past few years. Do you want to just paint a picture as we wrap up of what, in your view, a more robust kind of mix of programs, policies, and services might look like to manage the kind of tumultuousness and disruption that you described at the beginning? What would a more effective system, more integrated system look like at a kind of big picture level?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, I think the main thing I would emphasize there is I think that the government should look at how to introduce a stronger career and skills guidance approach in the employment services system. So we talked earlier about how Ontario's employment services, they are largely oriented towards helping those who are unemployed. And so in the current state, by the time most workers access those services, they're already in a state of crisis. And this just has real costs. So finding ways to equip employment service providers to work in this world of constant career transitions and be better able to serve working adults, I think is a really critical action area. And that could look like investing in new training and professional development for career development practitioners working in those centers. It could look at pilot testing new service models that look at providing hands-on career guidance to workers at risk of disruption. I would just add that I think the cost of not doing this is massive, because if we wait until people that are facing disruption are already unemployed, it's going to have a really detrimental impact for those individuals in terms of, their sense of trust and self-esteem. And, it's a missed opportunity really to help those workers also more proactively transition into career opportunities that work for them and where there is demand and need for more workers and skills in the Ontario economy.
Well said. As you say, not only is there individualized costs for those workers and their households, but as you said at the outset, there's massive opportunity costs for Ontario's economy because of the mismatch issue. This has been a masterclass, Kelly, in working through some big, complex questions about the labor market and Ontario policy. I want to thank you and your colleagues at Bllueprint for contributing to our series. Again, the policy brief is entitled "The Workforce Ontario Needs: How to Strengthen Skills Development." Viewers can find it at our website, on360.ca. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Kelly. Look forward to be back with another policy video in the coming days.